Obviously, we are going to get employment from the sector. We are going to get royalty that's going to be paid on the revenue which are derived from the oil. Currently, our royalty rate is 5%. We are going to get tax on that revenue, which is 35%. And also, there's a provision for additional tax on windfall profit that is negotiated between the government and the producers. So in that range already, there's really a good economic impact coming to the country through the state in terms of, as I said, either because of the royalty or because of the tax, and that is what is going to come towards us. Now, while I'm talking about the economic impact in terms of the taxes, there is also a question that is being asked to say, I did say, for example, that in all these licenses, NAMCO has got a 10% ownership. And there always has been a question to say, but how come we only have got 10% ownership in this resource? And therefore, people then argue that the impact is not as big because we are only having 10% through the state-owned company, which is NAMCO. And we need to argue for more ownership. If you look at it, it sounds like, yeah, I mean, if you're only getting 10% out of 100, you're not getting much out of it, are you? But we need to start looking at this issue also differently. As I said, first, what benefit do you get when you own something in terms of a company? The ownership can only reward you to pay you dividend from the ownership that you have got. You produce something, you get the revenue, you have got your cost, and the difference between your revenue and your cost is what is remaining as a profit. And as the owner, then you get the dividend if there's enough profit being declared for you to get your profit. Now, I want us also to start looking at it this way, to say, of the revenue that the company is going to generate, how much do we get from that revenue? Before you even talk about the profit and therefore how much you get of the profit. It makes also better sense to really just look at the revenue that is generated before you take off all the expenditure. Now, in terms of what I've just said, in terms of the royalty, in terms of the taxes, and in terms of additional tax you can get, the model shows that we're actually going to get up to 55% of that revenue. And on top of that 55% of the revenue, you also get your reward on your 10% should there be profit being made on that. And therefore, you do not only really get benefit from ownership, but you can also get the economic impact from other sources rather than necessarily just ownership that only reward you through dividend. So I thought I'll just do that. But that is the economic impact you have got. Now, the other economic impact you're also going to have is through, I think it was said here, value addition, and other things can, things that can come up simply because you do have oil and gas sector. And this is where the local content issues come in. In other words, how much value can be created within the economy simply because you now have discovered oil and gas? And that can come in terms of goods and services that has to be provided to the oil industry. Now, that local content, for me, is even more impactful to the economy. If well done, you can actually get less than you can get from the direct revenue that you get from the oil sector. For example, you can think about These are very highly sophisticated industry. You can think about the engineering service that must be provided to these companies. You can think about the some other transportation. You can think about the catering. You can think about the SOPs that need to be constructed. And I think, for me, that is really where the value is going to come from. The question, though, is this, that are we, as Namibians, are we ready then, through our entrepreneurs, are we ready to be in a position by the time those services are required? Will we be in a position actually to provide that service to the oil industry? Because it will make no sense for us to demand that the engineering service must be provided by Namibian companies, whereas we know very well that we don't have companies like that that are ready. And therefore, the question really we need to start to ask ourselves, how do we put ourselves in a position that we are ready to provide this service when it will be required? And I'm calling on the Namibian business people to really follow this local content issue and make sure that they understand what it is, and not only understand, but also make sure that they are ready to be able to do that. Also, the value is also going to be more impactful when really the services are created within the local content or the local economy. When the goods are created here, it will make no sense to simply say, oh, as long as it's provided by a Namibian company, but that Namibian company is going to import the service or the goods in any case. And that's normally what we do. We want to argue to say we are a Namibian company and therefore I want to provide a service, but you do not actually create the service yourself. Whether it's an IT service, whether it's a legal service, or whatever service you're going to provide, are you be the one actually who is providing them? Or you're simply going to buy it from somewhere else and then give it to the oil companies? So we need to make sure that we are in a position to provide those. And obviously, there are certain services that are much easier to provide. You can think of, for example, maybe catering. It's a very simple service to provide. And therefore, from day one, we should be in a position to provide that service. But services like engineering services, those are highly technical. And therefore, it might take some time for us to be in a position to provide that. And therefore, we may not be in a position from day one to insist that the oil companies need to source that kind of a service from our Namibian companies, but rather to allow them time to be ready. And again, it depends on what sort of processes and procedure we are going to put in place that our companies are going to be ready during a course of time. For example, we might say, for this specific kind of services, maybe from day one, there will be no requirement for local content, but maybe by year 2 or year 3, 10% must be sourced locally. By year 10, 50% must be sourced. So it's progressive based, allowing people to be ready to provide these services. So that's very, very, I think, important, and I think most of the value is going to be created through that local content system. And also just here to say that as a ministry, we do currently have a local content policy that what is drafted. The idea is to discuss that local content draft publicly so that we can have as much input as possible to make sure that by the time it's adopted and by the time also it becomes law, is something that we're all familiar with and therefore we've all given our input. So there will be a time when we actually have a public discussion how that local content is going to look like. The other issues being asked is that, is it going to be a curse or going to be a blessing for us? Now, the short answer to that question is really just like, it depends on what we decide to do. It really all just depends on what we decide to do. Now, it can become a curse in two ways. It can become a curse economically in a way of socio-political issues. On the economic side, for example, it can become a case if We suddenly, because we got oil and gas, which is going to get us a lot of revenue. Somebody talk about 3.5 billion, maybe less, maybe more, but that's a lot of money. Suddenly, because we do have that revenue, we decide to neglect all the other sectors of the economy. We no longer want to do agriculture because we say, look, we've got money, we can always buy our food. We no longer want to do the fisheries because, like, oh, fish is not really, this is more money. We somehow neglect all the other sectors. Now, if you do that, obviously what's going to happen is that, by the time the oil is not, it's going to be depleted, or one day, it means your economy can no longer function without having an oil sector. That's why it can become a case such that you're really just focusing on one and you neglect all the other sectors of the economy. The other way it can actually become a case economically is that if we then were to only depend on the revenue coming from oil, and then we always think that oil is always there, the revenue is there, your budget is always inflated because you got oil, and suddenly you can no longer actually get enough money from the oil sector simply because, as we know, the oil price is very volatile. As we know, we're experiencing all this today. Last year, towards the end, in the last quarter of last year, the price of crude oil went down as like $20. You remember that? And suddenly now it's 120. Now imagine if you're relying on a certain level of price of crude oil, and that's where you're fishing your budget on, and then you go on borrowing because you know you're going to get the money, and the price just goes up. What happens? It can actually cause economic instability within the economy, and therefore that is another way how it can become a case, and therefore we need to be very careful how we deal with that. On the socio-economic issue, obviously, and that's probably where most people think about how this can become a case, where, for example, the money is stolen, it's put in my pocket, and you guys get nothing out of it. It can happen, or it can happen where, in other countries where, because of really this revenue from the oil, you get too much influence from outside, external influence, and that can be destabilizing. And therefore it becomes a security issue, and therefore eventually it just becomes a very, very, very difficult issue to manage. And therefore those are all issues that we have to make sure that we actually have got the processes, we have got the institutions, and make sure that our institutions that are going to manage this are very strong institutions with the people who know what they are doing, so that at least you do not allow some of this to happen. And therefore, the way you manage your revenue coming from this is really done in a very systematic way, such that you really manage this resource not only for this current generation, but also for the future generations. And I think in that respect of the future generation, we are also, I think, in a very good position. You might have recalled when not long ago the president have launched the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And the idea was to use the Sovereign Wealth Fund to deposit some of the revenues that we get from our natural resources, whether it's going to be in our oil and gas, whether it's going to be fisheries, or whether it's going to be minerals. So into that fund, we are going to deposit some of the fund of the revenue. That will not be withdrawn. You can only withdraw the interest from that fund. But even when you withdraw that interest, it's only when it's approved by Parliament, so that you don't have either the Minister of Energy that said, I want money from this fund, or the Minister of Finance wants the money, or somebody wants the money. So you make it so difficult that fund is really sovereign wealth fund, but it's for the future generations. So I think on that score, we are probably ahead of the game. We are doing quite well. And also I believe our institutions, whether it's political or otherwise, relatively something like this, people do go crazy. Huh? We go crazy. Suddenly I'm like, this is So we do have the process, but we need to make sure that we continue to build on those strong institutions to make sure that we do not fail to manage this resource.